I'm talking to spiritual people, okay? I'm not talking to people who aren't interested in spirituality. I want to specifically talk to spiritual people today about politics. If you're not interested in spirituality, it's not for you. But if you are, I'm going to try to bridge together one of the hardest things, bring together Democrats and Republicans in a way that can only be done spiritually. That's why I'm not going to bother. I wouldn't want to talk to anybody who doesn't want to see it that way. But if you're interested in uniting this country in a real deep, meaningful way, it's not going to happen through politics. Nobody's going to argue the other side into seeing their point of view. But it can happen through spirituality. Let me start with this simple concept. The root of the word politics, politikos, okay? And part of that word is polites. Or maybe it's polites or something, I don't know. That's the root of the word. It means citizens. And when you put a couple Greek words together, politikos, it means pertaining to the people, of or relating to the citizens of a state. That's what politics is. Now, in Matthew 16:23, one of the coolest lines in the Bible, Jesus had been explaining to the disciples that he was going to get crucified. He was telling them that he was going to go through a whole bunch of adversity and that he was going to get killed. Peter, his right-hand man, who was supposed to know all this stuff really well, says to him, "You can't do that. You can't go get killed. They're not going to do that to you. You're the Lord. They can't persecute you. They're not going to kill you." And probably the most underrated line in the Bible, Jesus says, "Satan, get behind me. You are a hindrance to me," he says to Peter/Satan, "for you are focused on the affairs of man, while I'm focused on the affairs of God." So the moment Peter is saying, "Hey, that's a bad thing, this physical stuff that's going to happen to you," Jesus admonishes him and calls him Satan, and he basically infers politics by saying, you're focused on the affairs of man, the physical property of things. I'm focused on the affairs of God, which is the spiritual property of things. Politics is focused on man. Spirituality is focused on souls, the spiritual development of things. So we're going to go through how to unify politically with spirituality in mind. It's not going to work if you don't want to be spiritual. Go ahead and argue with each other. But if you want to be spiritual, it can work. So there's an Eastern philosophy. I was looking up the origin of it, and then Buddha gets credit for it, Krishna gets credit for it. But it's an Eastern philosophy that I read once that says this: if you wish to see the truth, give up your opinions. If you wish to see truth, give up your opinions. See, opinions are relative. Opinions, which we've all got, happen to, or we experience opinions based upon our conditioning. For example, where you're born, who you're born to, the skin color you're born in, the gender you're born in. That's going to affect your opinions for obvious reasons. Problem is, you're experiencing that relatively. To experience oneness and unity in all things, you have to give up your opinions. You have to be willing to see things from other points of view as well. If you just stick with your point of view, all you know is your experience. You don't know other people's experience. Politics, a heck of a lot of politics, is exactly opposite that. People in their opinions insisting that they're right and the other person's wrong, and there's only one way to do things. So the teaching in the Eastern philosophy to give up your opinions is how you're going to access truth. There's a Chinese proverb that says we're all on the same journey. Those who blame others haven't started the journey. Those who blame themselves are halfway there. Those who blame no one have arrived. Also giving up opinions on a pretty deep level. What's politics other than always blaming the other guy for the misery that we're having in so many different ways? And it's reaching epic proportions in this country right now, right? With crazy behaviors of blaming other and hating other and all that kind of stuff. And it's not taking personal responsibility and recognizing I've got a job in all of this. Here's a Hawaiian proverb, aloha keakua kuleana. And there's a great song on the internet by Nako Bear on this, which is in Hawaiian, aloha, it's a hello but an embracing, I honor you way. Keakua is the God. And kuleana means, and I take personal responsibility. Each of us have a personal responsibility as spiritual beings to bring spirit into the world. Not to bring politics into the world and focus on the affairs of man. As a spiritual being who's interested in developing goodness of God on this earth, we have to bring spirit into each situation. There's a difference between right and righteous. Right is what human beings do. Righteousness is something spiritual beings do. And when people argue over what's right, they're not going to get anywhere. Again, unless that's what they want to do. But for spiritual beings, you've got one job: bring righteousness into the world. That's why Jesus admonishes Peter. You're worried about me getting killed? I'm focusing on what God wants. And you're going to make it into the flesh? I don't want any part of that, said Jesus. You're a hindrance to me. Things of man are issues, right? It's pretty easy to do. Go through all of them. Who should we distribute the money to? Physical. Taxes themselves, physical. Pro-life, pro-choice. Talking about babies, physical. War, physical. What does the Bible say about this, Ecclesiastes? There's a time for war, there's a time for peace, there's a time for love, there's a time for hate. I guess that means there's a time for pro-life, there's a time for pro-choice. There's a time to tax, there's a time not to tax, right? There's a time for Democrats, there's a time for Republicans. It's not a big shock. We know there's going to be a Democrat president probably next, and then there's going to be a Republican, then there's going to be a Democrat. Has anybody caught this trend yet? American politics is yin arguing with yang. It's flesh versus flesh. It's seeing the world physically, and people are debating it. Now, as a therapist, I've seen the answer is it always depends. It's one of Buddha's best lines. He would say, if you ask him a question, that does not further if what you're doing is asking about things of man. Because you got to give me more context. I've seen welfare work for people. I've also seen people stuck by it. War is an obvious example of sometimes we sort of got to do it, but other times maybe it's a bad idea. Pretty easy to see. And depending on the situation you're in, you might disagree with that, but that's because that's your situation. My job spiritually is to learn how to see and connect with you on that, not judge you for it. John 7:24 is Jesus specifically clarifying this. Judge not by mere appearances, he says, judge correctly. He doesn't say not to judge. He says you should judge, but you judge correctly. And he makes it clear how to judge. Not by mere appearances. What's mere appearances? Flesh. It's the stuff you can see. That's the mere appearances. There's American politics for you. That party believes this, they do that, and they're wrong because you think you know their intent, and vice versa. The fact is, neither party has the monopoly on compassion. They just think that they do, right? You can't tell what the other person's intent is. It's really easily characterized by the simple concept of give a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach a man to fish, he eats for his life. It's a simple concept because if a man is starving, are you going to go up to him and say, I'm going to teach you how to fish? You're going to first give him a fish, aren't you? You feed him that day. Then you teach him how to fish. Logical, right? So they both work depending upon the context. But if you just give him a fish every day, by the end of it, a couple years later, he's still expecting the fish. But you're surely going to feed the guy a fish if he needs it. So they both work together, right? All things work together for good for those who love God. There's a role for Republicans and Democrats here, spiritually speaking. All things work together means how many things? All things work together for good for those who love God. See, that's spirituality. And it's not judging the other party who's better and who's worse. And this counts for everybody because, again, it's all things. So I love to ask the question, would Jesus be a Democrat or Republican? You helped me with this one. Earlier I said, well, he wouldn't care, he wouldn't vote. I don't know if he would or not. He would probably, maybe, I don't know. But my opinion, wouldn't be a Democrat or Republican because he'd be both, whatever that would be, or neither. Because he is a uniter, not a divider. But he wouldn't do it with politics, as he clearly says himself, he's not interested in the affairs of man, he's interested in the affairs of God. Now, a simple way to think of it is, what are the things of God? They're just virtues, compassion and forgiveness and mercy and discipline, right? It's characteristics of the soul. It's not like God is messing with people. All of the teachings say that you have a responsibility, Kuliana. You have a responsibility to find your way back to God. That's your job. That's what karma is. It's why Jesus teaches you reap what you sow. In Galatians it says, those who seek things physically will reap physical things. Those who reap things, who seek things spiritually will reap spiritual things. So it's what your focus is. Go ahead for the flesh, but that's American politics. If you're doing it spiritually, you can reach across the aisle and shake the other person's hand. You could agree to disagree, and you might even debate about it, but you do so with spirit, not hate. What's happening today, it's easy to see when people are doing it with hate. But there's plenty of good people that disagree and yet can still be connected with the Spirit. I use a simple example, it's pizza toppings. Your favorite pizza topping?
Pepperoni.
And I like green peppers. That was for my daughter. So do we disagree? Sure. Is he wrong because I prefer green peppers and he likes pepperoni? We can agree to disagree and still split the pizza, right? Now, if I told him he was wrong because he doesn't like what I like, that'd be silly, also fairly judgmental, and also by mere appearances. Americans can come together and agree on something simple. There's different ways to solve problems. There's different ways. It makes a lot of sense in a lot of different ways. But if we keep insisting that our way is right, what ends up happening is we end up hating and resenting the other. And it doesn't work spiritually. So Jesus would be both. He'd find a way to unite, and he unites through the Spirit, which is to be merciful and compassionate and forgiving and all those things. And if that's what you're doing with your politics, you're not going to resent the other guy, right? You're going to see him for what he is, and you'll have a sense of peace. You might tell him he's wrong. I'm like, you really should try green peppers, right? Wouldn't that be amazing if that's what Congress did? Listen, I respect your point of view. That's aloha. Right? It's namaste. I respect your point of view, but I also respectfully disagree. Let's have a conversation about that. Leading with spirit. That's how American politics should be, leading with spirit. So I'm going to end with some lines by Krishna from the Bhagavad Gita. He says that all creatures are bewildered at birth by the delusion of opposing dualities. All creatures, which means every one of us gets sucked into this, are bewildered. Because it's like, after a while, you're like, wait a minute, there's a whole lot of yin and yang going on. Democrats and Republicans who work together? How's that even possible? That's bewildering. But it's bewildering because it's a delusion. They're not actually dualities. They're not opposing dualities. They work together perfectly fine. A spiritual person who understands what Paul says, all things work together, would also see, no, I've been deluded, because they actually work together just fine. My job is to see how that works. And if you can see that, you're no longer going to be bewildered by the opposing dualities. And he says, and when you perceive the unity in all creatures, the actual connection, the spirit in all creatures, which means which percent? 100%. All creatures, that includes Republicans and Democrats. When you can see the unity in all creatures, you attain the infinite spirit. So what if you don't perceive the unity in all creatures? You don't attain the infinite spirit. You know what you attain? Resentment and judgment and fear and all that kind of stuff. And then you see other, and you see separation. I'm right, you're wrong. Argue. Every election season is the most important election of our lifetimes. I hear that every single time. I'm like, oh, geez, I'm getting sick of that, okay? If you want your heads to explode over American politics, have at it. It seems a little stressful for me. I prefer trying to see the unity in all creatures. Sure enough, when you seek that, infinite spirit comes to you. And what does that sound like? Peaceful? Heck yeah. And now you can see how things work together. If we focus on the affairs of man, we're going to argue. If you focus on the affairs of God, you're going to feel connected. You know you're doing it because it feels peaceful. You can see it in another person because if they're acting crazy, they're probably looking at it physically. If you look at it spiritually and you trust, we can come together and you can bridge that gap. That's how it's done spiritually. If you want to do it physical, have at it, enjoy. I don't want to do it that way. What we need is people who are actually authentically spiritual to reach out across the aisle, greet the other side, and do so in a respectful way. Then we can establish some real change in this country, which of course is fairly well needed, but we'll do so in a peaceful way and not the destructive way that we're seeing right now.